Hello, in this video we're going to look at the next step in our assessment, which is moving the FSMO roles. One of the things is that when you create your first domain controller in the first domain that's in the forest, it gets all of the roles. And it gets two forest-based roles, and these forest-based roles are the schema master, which is basically the repository or the of the definition. It's a definition of all of the Active Directory database entries. Okay, so it's a definition of all those different tables. So for example, first name of the user is a string and 20 characters long or something like that. Then there's also the domain naming master, which is a forest-based role, and that's looking at parent and child domains within the forest, what their relationship is, and additional trees within the forest. So a parent and child will make a tree, and there may be other trees in the forest as well. So the very first domain controller in the first domain in the forest is given these two crucial roles for the definition and the relationships of all of the different domains within the forest. Now, within every single domain that's created, whether it's a parent or child domain within a tree within the forest of trees, that within that domain there are three roles. And I'm just going to open up the PowerShell, and I'll show you how to find where all these roles are, and I'll explain what the last three roles are in a domain as well. So here we type in netdom query FSMO. And so this tells us that the schema master in this case, this thing here, is on the HODC1. The domain naming master is also on that, and so is the PDC. Now the PDC is the primary domain controller emulator, and it's really a hangover from earlier days, and where we needed a single read-write version of all of the security information for the domain. And so we had a PDC, and we had, in case that thing fell over, a thing called a BDC, a backup domain controller. These days you can have as many domain controllers as you like, pretty much, but one of them within the domain must take the role of the primary domain controller emulator. And so this allows interaction with older servers. Not that that happens much these days, and it also gets preferential replication of all password changes. And so when you're logging in to a domain, if the server that is closest to you that you're attempting to log in against in your domain, if you log in and it doesn't match the same password, before it rejects your login attempt, it will go to the primary domain controller emulator domain controller within the domain and check to see whether there's been a change before it actually rejects the login attempt. So all password changes preferentially get replicated to the PDC emulator. The relative ID master, which is this one here, gives out IDs for every object in the domain, so that in combination, so it's like a random number, and in combination with the domain security ID becomes the domain's globally unique identifier for every object in that domain, which ties every object in the domain to that domain. And so that domain becomes a security boundary beyond which nothing moves. So moving an object from one domain to another is incredibly difficult unless you can strip off the domain security ID from a relative ID master and pass it to the relative ID master of the domain that you're wishing to put that object into, and it reattaches its domain security ID, and then you get a brand new globally unique identifier for that object as it's moved from one domain to the other. So it's not an easy thing to do, and you've got to have good access to both domains relative ID masters. So anyway, that's what the relative ID master does. It gives a globally unique identifier for every object within that domain. Now, the infrastructure master is all about relationships. So things like which users are in which groups are members of which other groups, all that sort of stuff. It's all about relationships, organizational units, groups, users, all that sort of stuff. So there needs to be a PDC emulator, relative ID master, and infrastructure master in every single domain. Now, the infrastructure master is an interesting one. Normally, the relative ID master and the PDC emulator should be kept together. The infrastructure master normally is not kept on any domain controller that is a global catalog, and a global catalog server is one that processes logon attempts. So if I open up on this DC1 and go to Tools and go to Active Directory Sites and Services, and click on the servers, you can see here that in actual fact all three domain controllers in this domain are all global catalogs. Okay, and so if every domain controller within the domain is a global catalog server, which means they can all process logon attempts, then the infrastructure master is going to be on one of those, but because all domain controllers are global catalog servers and they all participate in replication, it won't matter. Okay, so normally if one of the servers is not a global catalog server, then that's the one that becomes the infrastructure master. We need to move the role to that infrastructure master. Okay, so there are some general rules which I'm just going to put up, which I cut off the net. Here's the three rules. So in your forest root domain, so this is the first domain created in the in the forest, within the tree, within the forest. Keep your schema master and your domain naming master on the same domain controller, and it needs to be a global catalog server. Okay, so schema master, domain naming master, global catalog server. In each domain, place the PDC emulator and the relative ID master roles on the same domain controller. And in each domain, make sure that the infrastructure master role is not held by a domain controller that also hosts the global catalog. Okay, now you can only do that if there is a domain controller that's not a global catalog server. Now in our domain, we made all of our domain controllers global catalog servers, so it can't be avoided. That's where it is. But as soon as I turn off the global catalog on one of these servers, then that's the server that the infrastructure master should go to. So why else would we want to move operational master roles or FSMO roles? The reason is that the very first server in the very first domain in the forest is consequently the oldest machine that you have. And statistically, it's the one that is going to fail first. Okay. In every domain, the first domain controller is going to be your oldest domain controller. And, we have an upgrade cycle. Maybe it's every 3 years, maybe it's every 5 years. And what we do is we take out our oldest server and replace it with a new one, hopefully before the server has had a chance to catastrophically fail and die. That can happen, of course. And so we've done a very nice transition to a new model server, and everything continues on nicely. That's what we would rather have in our networks, in our domains. So The reasons then that we might want to transfer these operational master roles away from the first domain controller is the age of the machine. So it's the oldest machine, and we need to upgrade it. So, every few years we're going to upgrade machines. We're going to need to transfer the roles. The other one is that, and it's nice to do that gracefully, that we can transfer it gracefully. However, if the thing has failed catastrophically, and then all of a sudden you can no longer add objects to your domain because the relative ID master is no longer available, and you can't add users to groups because there's no infrastructure master or something like that, or your schema master, so you can't install, for example, something that changes the schema, like a mail server or Exchange or something like that, and you can't add child domains for branch offices to your domain because the domain naming master is no longer there. So it sometimes happens that when our older server dies and it's got all these roles, nobody knows until all of a sudden there's things that you can't do, and they were examples of some of those things that you can't do. And by default, the very first domain controller in the forest is the global catalog server, against which everyone has to log in, and we make all the other domain controllers global catalogs by ticking a box. I mean, we could actually turn those off so that they weren't, and we're going to do that so that we can transfer one of these roles here. Okay, so if the machine has catastrophically failed and we know that that machine is not going to come back up again and the roles are on it, then we might need to seize those roles onto a new server. So the choices are transfer it gracefully, and there's two ways to do that: via the command line, or via the GUI. Certainly for the domain ones you can do that. That's relatively easy. Or you can seize the role if the machine's no longer available and you know that it will never come back up again, because you can't have two servers with the roles in the domain or forest. Okay, so that's the reasons why. So let's look at moving some of these roles, and we'll look at two different ways to do it. So we might look at, for example, the way to do it via the GUI first, and we're not going to actually do it that way. What we're going to do is we're going to do it via the command line. So in the Active Directory, let's go to domains and trusts. So domains and trusts is really at the forest sort of level. And what you see on here is, if I right mouse click the top here, you can see operational master roles. And you can see here that I'm currently on DC1, so this is my machine here. So, and you can see that the domain naming master is currently on DC1, and the choice is to transfer it to DC1, change. Well, obviously that's not much use. So what we could do is change which server we're actually logged into, change Active Directory server domain controller, and we could pick DC2, for example. And then when we look at the operational masters, we could change it from DC1 to DC2. Okay, so we hit the change button. That's going to change that role to the secondary or the HODC2. So we could do that. And are you sure you want to transfer that operational master role to a different computer? And we could go yes or no. Now normally you wouldn't bother doing this because you don't want to separate the schema master and the domain naming master role anyway, because you want to keep that on a global catalog server according to our rules here. We want to keep the schema master and the domain naming master on the same domain controller with a global catalog. Okay, but we could do it. So we could transfer this. Now you notice here that we've only got really access in the operational master roles to the domain naming master. So it's, you can actually link in, like by creating a new management console and activating a particular thing to allow you to look at the schema master as well. So most domain administrators don't bother doing it this way for the forest-based roles. They'll normally do those via the command line, which is what we're going to do. I'll show you the other place that you can look at changing the 3 domain-based operational master roles, and you do that not at this sort of domain level. You do this in the users and computers, okay, which is at the, sorry, that's at the domain level rather than the forest level. So when we're looking at that, and you have a look at the Active Directory users and computers, whoops, so I need to go to the domain, sorry, because we're looking at the domain level. We can look at the operational masters in the domain. And here we can see the relative ID master, primary domain controller, emulator, and infrastructure master. And there's only one server in the domain that performs this role. It'll say that there's only one server that performs the role. It says that for all of these roles. These are single master roles, single server roles. Okay, so again, we need to say that we're going to change domain controller to the second domain controller, and we could then look at the operational masters, and we could then change it from DC1 to DC2. I mean, so this is relatively easy within the domain, no problems, via the GUI. The only one that's not easy to do is the schema master. Okay, so let me show you an easier way to do it. It's actually via the command line. And so from the command line here, we ran this command here, which allowed us to find which domain controller holds the operational master roles. So what I want to do is I just want to go back and change the DC2 to not be a global catalog server, so I can transfer the infrastructure master to that server, to the DC2. So let me just go back to sites and services, and it's in sites and services that we can actually change global catalog. So if you have a look at the servers here, I'm going to expand out DC2, and on the NTDS settings, if you do a right mouse click and look at its properties, there's a box here for ticking for global catalog or not. Okay, so if I untick that and go apply and go OK, hit the refresh button on here, and you can see now that BO1DC, HODC1 are both global catalog servers, and HODC2 is just a domain controller. It's just a DC. Okay, that's the one that we should put the infrastructure master on. So let's do that via our command line. Okay, so the way that we do this is we type in move Active Directory. Can we hit the tab button? No, not yet. It did. It auto put it in for me. So it's AD Directory Server Operations Master role. So you can just hit the tab key at a particular point and all that will pop up. Okay, so now what we need to do is we're going to move the operational master role to what? So if we go identity, HODC2. So I want to move it to HODC2. What do I want to move? Operation. Oops, it came through anyway. Operation master role. So now I just specify whichever role that I want. So if I put the schema master, comma, the domain naming master, comma, the primary domain controller emulator, the relative ID master, hit the tab, the infrastructure master, and hit yes, then what will happen is it'll move all of those roles to the head office DC2 over here. Now, we don't actually want all of these. We actually only want the infrastructure master. So I'm just going to, but you can do all these just like that. There is an additional way you can do this. You can just go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and that will do the same thing. It's like an index. So I'm going to go infrastructure master, and I'm going to hit enter, and it says, do you want to move the operational master role? And at this point here, like if I had all 5, I could go no to some and yes to all, or yes to, I can hit A for yes to all, or just hit no, 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 and then yes for the infrastructure master. So I want yes. If I just hit enter, then that's the default is yes. You can see it's highlighted in yellow. So that moves the infrastructure role to HODC2. And we're going to check that by looking at the netdom query FSMO. And we can see here that the infrastructure master is now on DC2. Okay. And if we were actually inside our Active Directory users and computers, and we expanded and went to the operational masters here, tells you an infrastructure master is DC2. Okay, so it tells you in both of these. Okay. Now, I mentioned what would happen if the machine had catastrophically failed, our first 7, we wanted to move it. Then the command that we would do is this one with a /force on the end. The force is seizing the role off a dead computer. Okay, and effectively what it does is it says the HODC2, which already has a copy of all of the information in Active Directory anyway, we're just saying that this is now the read-write version of the infrastructure data, which is one of the partitions of Active Directory replication. Okay, so when we look at Control C, if I went repadmin /show replication, you can see here, here's our domain data, here's our configuration information, here's our schema information. Okay, so think of this as the schema master, think of this as our domain naming master, think of this as the other 3, you know, PDC, infrastructure, and relative ID master. And so, you know, this partition in Active Directory replication is affected by the operational master roles. Okay, so what you need to do to show in the assessment is something like this, where you've done a netdom query, you've moved an operational master role to one of the computers, and then you've done another net DOM query FSMO, and you can show that it's now changed from there to there, sorry, from there. Okay, so a screen capture of that proves it, that you can actually move roles. And that's what needs to be shown in moving operational master roles, is that you can do that. Okay, so that ends this video.